Hello and welcome. This is a fireside chat between myself and Joel Telpner, my good friend, Chief Legal Officer of IO, and also one of the most brilliant legal minds in the cryptocurrency space. And I've had the great pleasure to work with Joel now for, I think it's almost 2 years.
Over 2.
Over 2 years, yeah. And the dream I'd imagine of a lot of academic lawyers is to participate in the making of laws, the writing of constitutions, the interpretation of these types of things, which is why people seek to become Supreme Court justices or legal professors. But very rarely, even if you aspire to these things, do you have an opportunity to write a constitution.
This is true.
Yeah, usually you have to have like a change of management, a very serious change of management to be able to write a new constitution. So let's talk a little bit about constitutions in general. What are they? What are they useful for? Who uses them? Who doesn't use them? It's an interesting topic that most of us take for granted, but we probably haven't thought too much about.
I think you can actually simplify a constitution and say it's a set of rules. But it's a set of rules to do what? It does 3 things. It establishes how you legislate, it establishes how you administer, and establishes how you adjudicate. So it creates this framework for those 3 functions. So let's contrast that with the typical corporate structure. A corporation, the way it governs, do the employees get to participate in that governance? Hell no. Do customers get to participate? Hell no. Do shareholders? Well, they get to elect on a representative basis directors. But as long as the directors are fulfilling a generalized obligation to maximize shareholder value, even shareholders have nothing to say going forward. So this is a very centralized, top-down approach. And shareholders really only have one recourse. If they don't like what the company is doing, they can take their investment and move it somewhere else. In contrast, what if we don't have that corporate structure? What if it doesn't exist? And so if you look at the US Constitution, the preamble started with the words, "we the people." Now, why did it say "we the people"? Well, it went on to say in order to form a more perfect union, because there was no corporate structure. There was no top-down. It was the people. It was the community coming together. Now, what's interesting is when you look at blockchain technology, it is almost as if we have created, through this new world, through this new technology, the equivalent of "we the people." Because if you think about it, the way a blockchain functions, people that are operating nodes, the people that are doing the validation process, whether it's miners in proof of work or stake pool operators in proof of stake, they're performing the 3 functions of a constitution already. I mean, they're the ones that are legislating. They're making the rules of how the blockchain functions. They're administering the blockchain. That's what the node operators do. That's what the validators do. And they're also adjudicating because they have the power and the ability in a decentralized governance system right now to decide what changes need to be made or how to make sure that those rules are being enacted. So why do we even need a constitution? Well, we've seen how blockchains govern themselves. It's not bad. It's not bad. But there's always room for some improvement. And so what if we could take the fact that we've got this decentralized world already, and we've got those 3 branches in effect of government already operating on a blockchain, but we could do a better job of providing some principles, some guiding philosophies, some thoughts by which this community that's already come together without that top-down corporate structure, what if we could create some principles and guiding concepts that they could operate by so that it helps to create that unified voice. It helps to create the ability for the community to function even more efficiently and more effectively than they already do in the blockchain world. That I think, is what a constitution is all about in the context of a decentralized blockchain world.
So yeah, let's follow up then. What is this notion of a more harmonious union? I mean, it's in the U.S. Constitution. So what does that mean in crypto land?
So first of all, the great thing about crypto land is it can mean whatever we want it to mean. So all of you are going to decide that ultimately. But we know that there are times where there are fundamental changes that have to be made to a blockchain, either because it's needed for the continued functionality of the blockchain or because it's just a desirable evolution of that blockchain. We know there are times that we want to look at things like how is value created in a blockchain ecosystem? What does the reward mechanism look like? What are the size of blockchain parameters? both basic but very, very complicated questions. And we know that the community can come together and they can collectively decide to make those changes, but it's helpful in the world of blockchain if you at least have some guidance as to how that's going to work. So we just heard Johnny talk about the MBO, and the MBO being a channel or a facilitator to bring together the voice of the community. And so the Constitution then becomes a set of principles and framework by which that community knows there are certain baseline concepts that we all agree to, that we want to maintain, that we want to preserve. So in the case of Cardano, we think it's incredibly important, and when I say we, I mean all of us, I think would agree that it's incredibly important to make sure that it's an inclusive network, that it is an empowering network, that it brings opportunities to the world and all those people that have been disfranchised historically. So what if we can embody those principles and concepts in a constitutional framework so that everything the community does going forward is constantly reminded and agrees that those principles of empowerment, of decentralized participation, of enfranchising those that have been disfranchised are always respected in everything we do. That is where the Constitution can come into play.
So I have a notion of things like freedom of religion, freedom of speech, the Bill of Rights kind of concept of a constitution. How does that translate to a blockchain constitution? Like, what is the freedom of speech, the freedom of religion, the don't let the British soldiers live in my house?
So I think that's a great question. And so I'm going to answer that in two ways. One, I'm going to say we don't know because this is going to be part of an amazing experiment.
Yeah.
So we're going to see how that evolves. But I think the way I would answer that is that this community is going to determine, as it has been already, but it's going to continue to determine what the future of Cardano looks like, what its embodiment is. But at the same time, we're suggesting, by introducing the concept of a constitution that the community will ultimately either decide to accept or reject, but we're suggesting that in the function and role of the community controlling its destiny, that there may be some fundamentals that we would like to see not change. So, for example, you talked about freedom of speech, freedom of religion. Well, it would really be great if there was a general consensus and guidance that said we're not going to do things as we continue to evolve Cardano, as the community continues to evolve Cardano, that would infringe on things like freedom of speech. We want that embedded in a common set of principles that everybody acknowledges and agrees to as they participate in the Cardano ecosystem, that, hey, let's not do things that take away rights of the community. Let's not do things that infringe on speech. Let's not do things that disenfranchise people. And so it doesn't mean that the community can't change the Constitution in the future. They can. It's their Constitution, so they can change it. But ideally, it'd be great if this Constitution, which hopefully would be difficult to change, embodies some of those fundamental principles that people that want to participate in the Cardano ecosystem, that want to utilize Cardano, are agreeing to as their base of common goals and aspirations that attract them to Cardano as opposed to maybe going to another blockchain ecosystem.
Yeah, I ran into this years ago with the Ethereum Classic and Ethereum debate, and it was a pretty interesting thing. There were two camps that were embedded in the Ethereum community when it began. There was one group that said, oh, well, we want a programmable Bitcoin. So we want all the values of Bitcoin. We want all the assumptions of Bitcoin, such as a fixed monetary policy and immutability and irreversibility and censorship resistance. And there was another group of people that were more entrepreneurial, and they said, we want a world computer, and we understand there's going to be some broken plates, and you're going to have to change things, and we don't really care if you change the monetary policy or you change this, that, or the other. I mean, it's not a perfect system. We're going to have to make changes. So when the DAO hack happened, it was obvious to both those sides what to do. The Ethereum Classic side said, well, you can't roll it back. That's antithetical to everything we stand for. And the world computer people said, well, if we don't roll it back, it could damage the progress of the world computer vision. We should do this for the good of the system. So because there was no constitution to draw from, it created a governance crisis because they were both right. They had both signed up to use the system under different assumptions of what the system valued. And I thought it was a great lesson of where you sometimes need to make very controversial things explicit So I guess one of the things we have to figure out as we chase the tail of the constitutional dog in 2023 is what things need to be made explicit and what things need to be made implicit.
So, by the way, so I think that's a great example because one could argue that, well, a blockchain is already decentralized. The community voted by their own actions, so why do you need a constitution? Well, as you said, maybe there would have been a better way to do that. Maybe there would have been, if there had been a constitutional framework in place, maybe it would have still ultimately resulted in the same outcome, but at least the process is how you had gotten there would have been different. So if we think about what should be in the Constitution, well, if we look at the Constitution, going back to what I started with, which is it's the rules of how you legislate, administer, and adjudicate, what if there's certain frameworks as to if there's a disagreement, how should the community go about resolving that? What if that's enshrined in the Constitution? And then the terms of the Constitution itself, although they can be amended, can't be amended easily. So it requires really a very high percentage of active participation of the community to amend that Constitution. Well, now we've got a framework that people that want to participate in Cardano have agreed to that say, if we want to make fundamental changes to the network and how it functions, yes, we can do it. In fact, it probably will happen, but we've got a methodology of how we're going to collect that voice. We have an approach as to what does that vote look like? What's the percentage of participation that's expected? How do we make sure that it's a diverse set of voices that are involved in making that determination? So a constitution can enshrine those rules that support and make sure that those fundamental principles that we all collectively agree to remain true, and that to change those fundamental principles that we all agree to is a very difficult, not impossible, but a difficult process. So if nothing else, the Constitution, by doing that, creates a much better, I think, approach to addressing that problem that you saw in Ethereum.
Yeah, and what's really cool is there's a beautiful coevolution of the members-based organization and the constitutional process, in that the MBO aggregates the people who are necessary to participate in the conversation about the Constitution and what should the Constitution be. And what's also really nifty is that it's a value sampling of the Cardano ecosystem at the moment. So before anybody participates, my advice is write down on a piece of paper alone, so no one influences you, what your values are, what you care about, the things that you think are sacred about Cardano. It could be the monetary policy, and there will only ever be X ADA. It could be your voice being attached to ADA and having fundamental rights attached to that, whatever they might be. And it would be really cool to see the convergence of that.
I agree.
Yeah, because there's a Venn diagram where there'll be some universal intersections, but then there's going to be radically different viewpoints. And the fun part and the frustrating part, I think, of next year is going to be how do we converge to and ratify that document.
And so I think you hit on something that I think that I'm really excited about and what we're suggesting, which is that you've heard and you will hear a lot more about on-chain voting. And so the process by which views and decisions are expressed and made is really cool. We're taking advantage of blockchain technology to its fullest by facilitating on-chain voting. But we're still human beings coming together in a collective way voluntarily. And so even on-chain voting is going to require debate, maybe heated debate, but different views being expressed, a dialogue that's healthy. And so you can't simply have on-chain voting in isolation. If we're going to have an ecosystem, that's why, in the slide Johnny had up a few minutes ago, we have a constitution that's top, that sets out principles. But then we've got a members-based organization that becomes a channel, a facilitator for the community to have the dialogue and the debate and the arguments that they need to have in order to govern collectively. And so the Constitution is going to set out, among other things, some of the principles by which that debate and that dialogue and those arguments can take place in order to facilitate that on-chain voting process. It's really, I think it creates a really amazing ecosystem.
Yeah, and so then I would be remiss if I didn't ask a lawyer this, because it's an interesting question.
And now I'm worried.
Yeah, so how do you create legal agency for a blockchain constitution? The frustration of blockchains, DAOs, dApps, is they don't technically exist.
Right.
The jurisdictions don't look at them and say, oh, that's like a corporation or an LLC or an individual. There tends to be a breaching of the veil where they, if they want to enforce something, they just go to the members who vote and say they're an unincorporated association or something like that. So how do you give a constitution agency like an end user license agreement would have, or these types of things for the fair use of the system?
So I think that's probably one of the hardest questions, by the way, as you think through this, because to a certain extent, I mean, one way to think about it is, well, if people don't like how a particular blockchain is governing itself, they can simply leave. There's not stickiness among blockchains. I mean, people can use whatever blockchain they want to use, and so if they don't like the governance structure of a particular blockchain, they'll just go somewhere else. But that said, I started out talking about a corporate structure. And, I know in a perfect world, we would go forward in a blockchain universe and never have things like corporate structures ever again. But the reality of the world we live in is that there are probably still roles within the ecosystem for some traditional legal structures to play a part of it. And so to the extent, for example, a community like Cardano is coming together and they say, we want to do certain things. The MBO can facilitate alongside it traditional corporate structures through which some of those collective actions can be undertaken. So they can be undertaken in a way that expresses the community's voice, but creates that traditional legal shield, so to speak, to create a protected way to operate and to conduct business. And so I think in the real world going forward, what we'll see as ecosystems like Cardano continue to evolve, it's going to be a collective universe that have some corporate structures within it that are playing a role, but unlike the traditional corporate enterprise world we see today, whatever that role is still at the behest of and under the auspices of and directed by the community itself. So that's the difference.
All right, so let's get into the more difficult questions.
All right.
Yeah. All right. So I'll give you a hypothetical scenario.
Oh.
So let's say we have a constitution and we have some notion of property rights. Let's say that the community gets together and they vote to move funds from one particular person's address. So the Dow hack scenario, or there's a social trust like entities receive money from Catalyst, and let's say the person who received the money got killed in a train wreck and nobody has access to the private keys. Would it be lawful and legitimate to use the voting system to move funds from one of those addresses back to the Treasury or to another group?
So if the community decided so, I guess you could say yes, but that's where some of the guardrails of a constitution come into play. So we don't have in a decentralized ecosystem a court system in the traditional sense, and the court system is only as good as the enforcement arm behind the court system. So we don't have the ability to put somebody in jail because they do something that the community doesn't like. So what do we do instead? Well, some of the principles enshrined in the Constitution that help make sure that we are collectively following those principles are promoting and ensuring certain transparency, certain openness, certain ability to evaluate participation using different types of merit criteria, for example, so that over time, the community itself can decide who are good players, who are bad players, who should be rewarded by participation and who maybe should be discouraged from participating. So the community itself can exercise that influence through different tools that are provided in the constitutional process that start to replicate a judiciary and enforcement arm.
Right, and that's where I guess I'm getting to, and this will be the final question. I wish we had more time because it's such a fun fireside chat. But adjudication and dispute resolution, the concept of a judiciary, this is an unusual thing in crypto land. We tend to say, well, that's meta to the system, but a constitution does have an opinion on the adjudication process. And this would be an example of, well, where does the money go? Or
right.
When do we involuntarily take something or do something? we tend to get in the industry very uncomfortable when nation states get involved and tell us what to do.
Right.
But that doesn't recuse us from the responsibility
No.
of some form of governance. And so what is the solution there? Should the Constitution explicitly spell out a proposed adjudication process for scenarios, or is that somehow ephemeral or somehow orthogonal to the constitutional process?
I think it can, at least to an extent. So I think it starts with that, IOG is helping to work on creating more standards for the industry collectively. And so part of the constitutional approach has to incorporate those best practices, industry standards. Second, I think the Constitution can and should include an adjudication process. And then by combining that with transparency and giving the community a voice to be able to utilize it in the adjudication process, and for the entire community to see that process in action and see the outcome and results, that will create, I think, a community-wide collective pressure, so to speak, to implement and follow an adjudication process. Now, again, is there an explicit enforcement arm the way we have in governments? No. But, with the principles of the Constitution, with a clear adjudication process, and with transparency anytime there is a dispute and how it's resolved, that creates a community-based approach for them to come together and maintain and support and utilize that adjudication process.
Okay, so the final question is, how can the community help you in this process? Where do they go for help? And then second, when constitutional convention? Okay,
so writing a constitution is easy, right? I mean, people do it all the time. And so if you look at how constitutions evolve, it can't just be a group of elderly statesmen sitting in a room. Yes, sometimes they come up with good things, like perhaps the founding fathers in the U.S. did to a certain extent. But a better constitution comes because they're voices of the people. And so we're going to, like Johnny and Michael talked about before, encourage those people that are interested, that have a passion, that want to make sure their voices are heard, to express their views. We're going to open up an opportunity for people to actually say, this is what we think should be in a constitution. This is what we think it should look like. It's not IOG that's going to dictate a constitution. It is the Cardano community. Our role is to simply suggest and facilitate. So ultimately, it's going to be the community. And as we put together, with everybody's input, a first version of what that looks like, then we're going to have to bring people together through, as you say, almost a constitutional convention, the way it happened in the United States. And we're probably going to debate, and we're going to argue, and we're going to have some interesting conversations in order to take it from a conceptual draft to what is the final constitution that will be approved by the community, not by us. Not by us. It's not ours. So the ADA community will decide what that looks like ultimately, or decide that they don't want one at all.
Can you show up like Benjamin Franklin?
Yes.
Thank you, everybody. This was so much fun, Joel. I really appreciate it. Cheers.